All right, I want to welcome you to the next lecture video, and this is on the book of Romans. And the book of Romans really is obviously, um, if in the New Testament, it's the first book listed, Paul's letters, and it is really kind of the cornerstone. It is one of the chief of Paul's epistles, um, and some early authors, uh, uh, theologian Thomas Drax said it is a quintessence and perfection of saving doctrine. Martin Luther called it the purest gospel, and John Calvin said it is an open door to all the most profound treasures of Scripture. There is virtually no dispute about the book of Romans. Most consider it to be the work of Paul, and most interesting is really the role of Paul's use of an amanuensis for the book of Romans. If you'll remember from our discussion about Paul, Paul does use an amanuensis. Remember, an amanuensis basically is a secretary, a scribe, somebody who does the writing for Paul. And we talked about that. You can go back to your notes on the Pauline epistles. And so Paul as the author. Here in Romans, it's very clear. He says in chapter 16, verse 22, I, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you in the Lord. Remember, there are several ways that he could have done it. He could have composed a letter from an outline that Paul gave him. He could have took dictation by shorthand and then later expanded it, or he could have taken it longhand, which is really where he would write word for word what Paul had said. Either way, any of these three here that you might well, that just messed up there, class. Any of these three are possible. I don't have a favor on one way or the other. But remember, one of the things that Paul faced a lot was probably his some eye problems. And so he would have used this, and maybe from the long journey that he would use an amanuensis. And this time we know that it is a gentleman named Tertius. Now, Romans comes around probably around 57 AD, and during Paul's third missionary journey, probably, I believe, most likely towards the end of that journey. I remember this third missionary journey would come across. He goes up, down, goes back around, and he's going to come back, and he's actually going to end up in Jerusalem. And he's writing to the church at Rome. It's interesting that the letter to the Romans is Paul's only letter that he writes to a church where he had not previously been to. And it is probably the transition in Paul's career because he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem. He's going to be arrested. He will eventually end up in Rome, but he's writing to them. He's never been there before. He's most likely writing from Corinth right before he sails to Jerusalem, probably around Acts chapter 20 is when that happens. And the letter bearer would probably be from the city of Corinth, because to go from Corinth to Rome was a very short journey. Let me back up here and show you. Let me change pen colors not to match with the red. Let me go to blue. Okay, so here is Corinth right here on your map. Okay, right up here is the boot of Italy. So to sail across here would be the quickest way then to travel up Italy into Rome. He spends time with Gaius, according to chapter 16, verse 23, who is also then Erastus is described as a city treasurer of Corinth, and so that's why we know that he is in Corinth. Now, some manuscripts omit the phrase in Rome. However, the evidence is that Paul was writing to Christians in Rome, which then leads to questions. If Paul had never been there to start the church, how did the church get started, and who was in the church? So Romans being the only letter that Paul writes to a church in which he had not previously been to prior to writing to them. So how was the church started? Most likely it was, tradition says, Peter and Paul founded the church. But most likely it is when people were saved at Pentecost and began to stay in Jerusalem. When the persecution began to happen, they scattered. The word here, diaspora, means scattered. And so most likely they were scattered, and some of them maybe returned to Rome at that time. And so most of the church seems to be Gentiles. Remember, Gentiles are non-Jews, but does have a strong Jewish element within the church itself. Now, Paul expresses his purpose to the Romans in chapter 15, verse 23. He says, "But now, with no further place for me in these regions, and since I have had many years longing to come to you," verse 24, "whenever I go to Spain," this is Paul's desire right here. Paul has a desire to eventually end up in the country of Spain. We've talked about this before. Whether he got there or not, we don't know. It's not mentioned in Scripture. But he says, hey, I'm going to pass by and see you, enjoy company with you, but now I'm going to Jerusalem to serve the saints. And that's why I believe it comes towards the end. And so he wants to go to Spain, but his purpose is to fulfill a theological treatise that's to kind of help the Romans understand a lot about salvation, understand what it means to be saved, understand what it means to grow in faith, and that's why it is one of Paul's chief letters. His theme is about the gospel of God. Major themes throughout the book of Romans really kind of give an understanding. He talks about the natural revelation that, and I love the verses here in 18 through 20 of chapter 1, that we look around at creation and we understand that there is a creator. And in ethics, we talk about the idea of the natural law. And then chapter 1, verses 21 through 32 is about the wrath of God, about those who continue to live outside the law of God. And great discussions have come out of these verses on sin, lifestyle choices, all sorts of areas that are approached through verses 21 through 32. We talk about the righteousness of God, chapter 3, verse 23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then we talks about Abraham, focuses in on having priority in faith. He talks about the benefits of being justified by faith. And yet while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, verse 5, chapter 5, verse 8. And then that we are justified by faith, even does it promote sin? And he really comes to the end. He says, no. He says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And he says, but the wages of our sin is death, but there is a free gift that comes from God for those who believe in him. He talks about having a life in the Spirit. He talks about the triumph of believing in God. There's some questions about Israel, which are some great passages. chapter 10, verses 9 through 10. Those who confess with their mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord will believe in him. And then the implications of God's lordship, of who he is, to love, and then to have unity in the church. And so this is a great book to be in, understand. And obviously, I think one of the key passages is in chapter 3, verses 21 through 26. And the key passage is really going to kick off the entire book of Romans is here in verse 23, that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that we need to be justified through this great gift, a free gift that God has given to us because he is the just and the justifier. And so let me give you the key facts here. He's writing to the Church of Rome. And then remember, this is the only church that he writes to that he has not been to before. He's writing from Corinth to bring them a hopefully effective launch into Spain, which again we're not sure that he gets to. I'm sorry, I went too fast. And I'll leave that up there. Again, if you have questions about saying things in class, you need to have some understanding, please don't hesitate to email me or stop by if you happen to be on campus. Have a great day.